My mom got married without inviting me. But when I found out she stole $45K from my grandparents for my college, I sued them both, and their marriages fell apart. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing in Chicago, and I need to tell this story because what my parents did to me basically left me without a family for years. And the truth is that until a few months ago, I didn't fully understand how fucked up everything was. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was like 8 years old and my parents started fighting all the time, like every day there were screams and door slamming, and I would lock myself in my room with headphones on, trying not to hear. I don't remember much from that time, honestly, because I think my brain blocked most of those memories, but what I do remember perfectly is the night my father, Eric, came home and told my mother he'd been laid off from the factory where he worked. He was like 40 at the time and had worked there since he was 22. And suddenly nothing. No job, no money, nothing. Things got worse after that, obviously. My mother, Julie, worked at a local diner making tips, and my father couldn't find work anywhere because, small town in Ohio. Not many opportunities. They fought about everything, literally everything, from who was going to pay the water bill to whose fault it was that I was getting bad grades in school. As if it was my fault, they were a mess. When I was 10, they finally got divorced, and it was horrible. I mean, not the divorce itself, because honestly I already wanted them to separate, but everything that came after. There was a super ugly custody battle, where basically neither of them really wanted me, but they also didn't want the other one to have me. You know what I mean? It was like I was a trophy in a competition that neither wanted to win, but also didn't want to lose. In the end, they reached a shared custody agreement that basically meant I spent 1 week with my mother and 1 week with my father, and neither of them really made an effort to, make me feel loved or important. My mother was always working at the diner, and when she came home she was too tired to talk to me. And my father spent his time watching TV and drinking beer while looking for work. Or so he said. But the truth is, I think he'd already stopped trying. My grandparents were the ones who really raised me during those years, both the paternal and maternal ones. Stanley and Jean, my father's parents, had a small farm on the outskirts of town, and I spent weekends with them helping with the chickens and horses, and they made me feel like I mattered, And Vincent and Norma, my mother's parents, had a hardware store in town, and I would go after school to help them organize things, and they always asked me how I was doing. What I'd learned that day, things my parents never asked. When the time came to go to college, I was 18, and honestly couldn't wait to get out of that shitty town and get away from my parents. I'd applied to Ohio State University and got accepted, and I remember when I told my parents, neither of them really reacted much. My mother said something like, "Oh, that's nice, honey," and my father just nodded and kept watching TV. The day I left, they both came to say goodbye, but it was super awkward. Like neither of them knew what to say and neither did I, so there were just these weird half hugs and a "see you later," and that was it. My grandparents all came, all 4 of them, and they hugged me and cried a little and told me they were proud of me and to call when I could, and that meant more to me than anything my parents could have said. College was amazing, honestly. I met Brandon, my roommate, who became my best friend, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. I didn't have to worry about fights or family drama or feeling invisible. I called my grandparents every week but hardly ever talked to my parents, maybe once a month or every 2 months, and the conversations were always super short and awkward. "Hi, how are you? Fine, and you fine? Okay, talk to you later?" That kind of thing. During my second year at university, I started noticing my parents were posting weird stuff on Facebook, like photos with people I didn't know and comments about starting a new life and things like that. But I didn't pay much attention because, honestly, I'd already gotten used to them living their lives without including me. Then one day, I think it was March of my 3rd year, I was scrolling through Facebook during a break between classes, and suddenly I see photos of my mother's wedding. And when I say I froze, I completely froze sitting there in the library with my phone in my hand, unable to believe what I was seeing. My mother, Julie, had married some guy named Jeffrey, and there was a whole gallery of photos, like 50 photos of the ceremony and reception and everything, and I had no fucking idea this was going to happen. They didn't invite me. They didn't tell me anything. Nothing at all. There were photos of her in her white dress and Jeffrey in his suit, and all their friends and some distant relatives I didn't even know. Well, but me, her only son, wasn't there. I sent her a text asking what the hell was going on, and she responded like 3 hours later saying it had been something small and intimate, and she didn't want to bother me during my exams. Which was a total lie, because my exams weren't until 2 months later. I was still processing that, when 2 weeks later, 2 weeks, I see that my father also got married. To a woman named Pamela, who was like 49 years old and worked in some sales thing. And he didn't invite me either. Didn't tell me anything either. Suddenly there were just photos on Facebook, and I found out the same way. I find out that my high school acquaintances had babies or bought houses. I called him that same night, totally furious, and we had a horrible fight on the phone where he basically told me I was part of his past and Pamela was his future, and that he needed to move forward with his life without the weight of his past mistakes. When I asked him if I was one of those mistakes, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Look, Zachary, you're already an adult and you have your own life. I deserve to have mine too." And he hung up. I sat there in my dorm room with Brandon staring at me, not knowing what to say. And I think that was the first time I really cried about all this. Like I cried like I hadn't cried in years. I told my grandparents what had happened, and they were all horrified. My grandmother, Jean, cried when I told her, and my grandfather, Stanley, was so angry his hands were shaking. Vincent and Norma couldn't believe it either. And Norma told me she'd talked to my mother a few weeks before the wedding and Julie hadn't even mentioned it, as if I simply didn't exist in her life. My grandparents told me they loved me and I would always have a place with them, and that helped a little. But the truth is, the damage was already done, you know? I felt like my own parents had erased me from their lives, like I'd never existed to them. Fast forward about a year and a half. I'd already graduated and moved to Chicago to work. And honestly, I was okay. Like I'd made peace with the fact that my parents were shit, and my real family was my grandparents, and Brandon and the friends I'd made in college. I visited my grandparents every 2 or 3 months. Always, all of them, because I didn't want any of them to feel left out, and they updated me on what was happening in town, including things about my parents that I didn't ask about, but they told me anyway. Apparently my mother's marriage to Jeffrey was more or less okay, and my father's to Pamela too, and I honestly didn't care. I just nodded and changed the subject. Then one day, I think it was October last year, I was visiting Stanley and Jean at the farm, and we were having coffee in the kitchen when my grandfather Stanley asked me if the money they'd lent my parents for my college had been enough, or if I needed help with student loans. And I sat there with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, completely confused, because I had no idea what he was talking about. I asked him what he meant, and he and Jean looked at each other with a weird face, like worried, and Stanley told me they'd lent my father like $25,000 when I started college to help with tuition and expenses, and that Vincent and Norma had lent my mother another $20,000 for the same thing. I sat there trying to process what they were telling me, because I'd paid for all my college with student loans and part-time jobs, and I still owed like $35,000 in loans that I was going to be paying for years. I asked them if they were sure that money was for me, and Stanley pulled out all the documents, like everything was there, contracts signed by my parents, where they specifically said the money was for my college education, and they were going to pay it back in 5 years with low interest. Stanley and Jean's loan had been made like 7 years ago, and Vincent and Norma's 6.5 years ago, and neither of my parents had paid a single cent. I couldn't breathe properly. I literally felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach. I went to visit Vincent and Norma that same afternoon, and they confirmed exactly the same thing. Showed me all the documents and text messages where my mother promised them she was going to start paying soon, that she just needed a little more time, that things were tough. But Vincent told me Julie had never intended to pay, that every time he brought up the subject, she got defensive and started crying, saying they didn't understand how hard her life was. Norma hugged me while I tried not to explode right there in their living room and told me not to worry, that they didn't blame me for any of this. That night in the town hotel where I was staying, I called Brandon and told him everything, and he was as furious as I was. He told me I needed to confront my parents, that I couldn't let this happen without doing anything, and he was right. And the next day, I went to the diner where my mother worked. It was like 3 in the afternoon, so there weren't many people, and I sat at the counter and waited for her to see me. When she finally noticed me, her face dropped, like she went pale immediately, and she came over to me with a fake smile asking what I was doing there. I told her we needed to talk, and she said she was working, and I told her we could talk there, or we could talk outside in front of all her customers. You decide. We went out to the back of the diner, where the alley with the trash containers was, and I asked her directly about the money. She got defensive immediately, saying that money was between her and her parents and it wasn't my business, and I yelled at her. And when I say I yelled, it's because I really yelled. That money was for me, that my grandparents had lent it specifically for my education, and she had stolen it. She started crying and saying she'd had expenses, that life was expensive, that I didn't understand how hard it had been for her. And I told her I didn't give a shit, that she'd emotionally abandoned me for years, that she hadn't even invited me to her wedding, and now I discovered she'd also stolen from me. The confrontation with my father was worse. I went to his house that same afternoon. Pamela opened the door, and when I told her I needed to talk to Eric, she let me in, but with an annoyed face that made it clear I wasn't welcome. My father was in the living room watching a football game, and when he saw me, he got up and asked me what I wanted. I told him what I'd discovered, and he basically told me his finances weren't my problem, that he'd do what he wanted with his money, and if my grandparents had a problem, they should talk to his lawyer. I told him that money wasn't his, it was mine. It was destined for my education. And he laughed, like he laughed in my face, and told me I'd already graduated, so what did I need that money for now? To stop being dramatic. Pamela was there, listening to everything, and didn't say anything, just looked at me like I was a plague that had invaded her house. I went back to my grandparents furious and told them what had happened. Stanley was calmer than I expected, like resigned, and told me he already knew this was going to happen. That's why he'd started considering legal options. Vincent had been thinking the same thing. Turns out both pairs of grandparents had talked to each other several times about this issue and had been gathering all the necessary documentation just in case. They told me they were going to sue my parents for the money plus interest and penalties, and they asked me if I was okay with that. I told them absolutely yes, to do whatever they had to do, that my parents deserved this and more. The lawsuit was filed about a month later. Both pairs of grandparents decided to join forces and file a single joint lawsuit with all the documentation, all the signed contracts, all the text messages and emails where my parents promised to pay, everything. The total amount they owed was like $50,000 between both loans, plus the accumulated interest over all those years. So, we're talking about something like $70,000 total. My parents hired a lawyer, but basically they had no case because all the evidence was against them, like everything was in writing and signed. The legal process lasted about 4 months, and during that time my parents' lives went to shit, and the truth is I didn't feel even a bit of pity. Jeffrey, my mother's husband, divorced her about 2 months after the lawsuit started because apparently he didn't want to be married to someone who was basically being sued for theft, and besides, he'd signed a prenup so he didn't lose anything by leaving. Pamela also left my father around the same time for the same reasons. My mother lost her job at the diner because the owner didn't want the drama, and my father couldn't get work anywhere, because in a small town, everyone finds out about everything, and nobody wanted to hire someone with a lawsuit like that pending. My grandparents didn't want to destroy them completely, they just wanted their money back and for my parents to learn a lesson. So, when it came time for the settlement, they agreed to let my parents sell whatever they had to sell to pay the debt. My mother had to sell her car and some furniture, and my father had to sell his truck that he probably loved more than me, and between the two of them, they gathered like $40,000. My grandparents agreed they could pay the rest in monthly installments over the next 3 years, and they also demanded that both write me formal apology letters admitting what they'd done. The letters arrived about 2 weeks after the settlement. My mother's was basically 3 paragraphs saying she regretted what had happened and hoped someday I could forgive her, but it felt super generic, like her lawyer had written it and she'd just copied it. My father's was even worse. Literally 2 super short paragraphs saying he recognized he'd handled the situation badly and hoped we could move forward. It didn't even specifically say sorry. I read them once and saved them in a folder on my computer, not because I wanted to keep them, but because my lawyer told me to save them in case I needed them in the future. About a month later, my grandparents told me my parents wanted to see me, that they wanted to try to fix things. Honestly, I didn't want to see them, like, not at all. But Stanley told me that sometimes facing things was better than avoiding them, and I guess he was right. I agreed to meet them at the same diner where my mother used to work, which was ironic considering everything, but it was a neutral public place, so it seemed okay. Brandon offered to come with me for moral support, but I told him I needed to do this alone. I arrived at the diner on a Saturday afternoon, and my parents were already there, sitting in a booth in the back, together but clearly not together, you know what I mean? There was like 2 feet of space between them, and neither looked comfortable. I sat across from them, and there was a super awkward silence where none of the 3 of us knew how to start. Finally, my mother said something about how much time had passed, as if we were at a casual reunion and not in the aftermath of them stealing money destined for my education. My father just looked at me with this weird expression, like between shame and resentment. I told them directly that I'd agreed to meet with them, but that didn't mean things were okay or that I forgave them. My mother started crying, obviously, and told me she'd made mistakes, but she was still my mother and that had to mean something. I told her that being a mother meant more than just giving me life. It meant being present and supporting me and not stealing from me, and she just cried more. My father interrupted me and told me I was too young to understand how hard life was, that they'd done the best they could with what they had. And I laughed because, seriously, that was their defense? The conversation lasted about an hour and basically went in circles, them trying to justify their actions and me telling them there was no possible justification. In the end, I told them I was going to maintain contact with them only because of my grandparents, that we could talk from time to time and maybe see each other at Christmas or Thanksgiving if my grandparents did something, but not to expect us to be a happy family again because that wasn't going to happen. My father nodded without saying anything, and my mother just kept crying. I got up, paid for my coffee, and left. That was about 6 months ago. Since then, I've talked to my parents, maybe 4 or 5 times, always short and superficial phone conversations. My mother got another job, I think at a clothing store or something, and my father is working in construction. They're still paying the monthly installments to my grandparents according to the agreement, so I guess at least they're complying with that. Jeffrey and Pamela never came back, obviously, and from what I know, my parents are living alone in their respective small houses trying to rebuild their lives. I keep visiting my grandparents regularly. Like every month and a half, I try to go to Ohio for a weekend to see them all. Stanley and Jean are still at the farm, though they're older now, and don't do as much physical work. They hire help for most things now. Vincent and Norma still have the hardware store, but they're thinking about selling it soon and retiring. They all tell me they're proud of how I handled the situation, that I was more mature than my own parents, and that means more to me than they can probably understand. Last week, my mother called to tell me my father had a minor accident at work. Nothing serious, but he'd hurt his back, and she asked if I could go visit him. He told her I'd send my best wishes, but I wasn't going to make a special trip for that if he needed something he should call me directly. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, I love you," and hung up before I could respond. I don't know if someday I'll be able to tell them I love them back. Honestly, I don't know if I really love them. Part of me still hates them for everything they did, for erasing me from their lives, for stealing from me, for never really being there for me. But another part, a very small part, just feels sorry for them because they basically destroyed their own lives out of selfishness, and now they're alone paying the consequences. I don't know what's going to happen in the future with my relationship with them, if we can even call it a relationship. For now, I'm okay keeping my distance, focusing on my work, on my friends, on the family that really matters to me, which is my grandparents. Brandon asks me sometimes if I regret supporting the lawsuit, and the answer is always no, not one bit. My parents deserve to face the consequences of their actions, and the fact that their new spouses left them and they lost their jobs was just karma doing its work. Maybe someday I can truly forgive them, not just say I do, but that day isn't today, and probably won't be soon, and I'm at peace with that.